Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar. It's my great pleasure to introduce today Paul Thompson. And it's very interesting because Paul has a background that many people will not expect in information retrieval. So I think that his talk is going to be very interesting because he can tell you of some of these techniques can be applied in the context of security. Paul received his PhD from University of California at Berkeley, and he's currently a research professor at Dartmouth, and he was previously associated with Drexel University and also with West Publishing Company. So it's my great pleasure to have him.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about semantic attacks and security. And I'll go into some of the research background for this project, which began 4.5 years ago at the Institute for Security Technology Studies at Dartmouth College. And the project, in a formal sense, ended about 2 years ago, but as I'll go into in some of this talk, there are various threads of it that are being continued. I'll talk about the relation of this project to detecting deception or counter-deception, and look at an example of a prototype that we built towards the end of this project, looking at detecting misinformation in news stories, and then moving ahead to some of the more future directions this work may take. About a little over a year ago, I was involved with a workshop at the Air Force Research Lab where they were looking at a new program of research called the Commander's Predictive Environment. And in particular, we were interested there in looking at deception detection again. And then just last summer, I took part in a National Science Foundation workshop where the workshop was focused on detecting deception in language. And this also turned out to be part of a broader series of workshops of looking at overall security evaluations, where they're concerned with background investigations, interviews, and interrogations. And it was anticipated there will be more funding in this area as well. So much of the work on deception detection has been done by psychologists or communications researchers, and in particular, the Air Force has funded work by Burgoon and other psychologists at the University of Arizona. And initially, this work was looking at detecting deception in face-to-face communication. But gradually, over the years, it sort of evolved into looking at detecting deception in computer-mediated communication. And then it started to overlap with semantic attacks or semantic hacking project that I was working on. So, for example, one of the things that some of the communication theorists claim is that just in everyday face-to-face conversation among people, over 50% of this communication is in some way deceptive, to varying degrees. So one of the issues here is identification of linguistic cues of deception. So say you're looking at computer-mediated communication, what kind of cues in the text could you pick up which is indicative of deception? This has also sometimes been called linguistic forensics, and an example of this would be authorship attribution, based on statistical analysis of writers' styles. And some of this work goes back quite a few years. Statisticians, Mosteller and Wallace back in the 1960s did work on attributing the authorship of the Federalist Papers written before the U.S. Constitution was adopted. Some were by known authors, but others, they weren't sure if it was Madison or Hamilton had written various of them. So there are also other government programs, such as the ACQUAINT program, Advanced Question Answering for Intelligence, where deception detection might also play a role. And in some of the sort of long-range planning for that program, they talked about the problem of detecting contradiction in various text on the same topic as something that you would need in order to do question answering properly. Another government program was NIMD, or Novel Intelligence and Massive Data, where I'll talk a little bit later in this talk about an example related to intelligence analysis with deception detection. And another area of research is deception among autonomous agents. And as I'll go into a little more shortly, there was a report by Martin Libicki written in 1994, which first developed the taxonomy of talking about computer security incidents or attacks as being physical, syntactic, or semantic. And he was largely concerned with the problem of autonomous agents, say a sensor network system in the battlefield that was being fed misinformation by an adversary. Also, Professor Eugene Santos, who recently came to Dartmouth from the University of Connecticut, has similarly been involved in research on autonomous agents and deception detection. In related areas, in some natural language processing in text, there's been a recent interest in detecting sentiment or emotion or affect in text. Other researchers have been looking at detecting emotion in speech, or there are some current Homeland Security border security initiatives that are looking at video or trying to fuse information from both audio and video sources, say like at a customs agent or something like that, that you could, through surveillance, provide the agent some real-time indications that maybe there's some deception based on audio or video analysis. And as I mentioned with the security evaluations program, one of the parties that's interested in that is the Defense Polygraph Institute. So as some of the traditional physiological detection of deception in like lie detectors has been called into question by some studies, they're interested in trying to move beyond that, or to look at situations, say interrogations in a battle setting where you can't strap on all the equipment or something like that. So the particular project that I'm mostly focusing on was called the Semantic Hacking Project. This was work that I was involved with at the Institute for Security Technology Studies at Dartmouth College from 2001 through 2003. Other people working on the project included Professor George Sabenko and his doctoral student, Anna-Rita Gianni. This work was funded by the National Institute of Justice, and unlike the earlier work I mentioned by Libicki, which was more concerned with battle sort of settings, our focus was on computer security. So as I mentioned in his report, The Mesh and the Net, Speculations on Armed Conflict in an Age of Free Silicon, Libicki divided attacks into these types of physical, syntactic, and semantic. And because we were more concerned with, say, something like an end user on the web being misled by misinformation, we started calling what we were doing cognitive hacking or cognitive attacks instead of semantic. And partly the motivation for that was that people in computer science theory, were talking about the semantics of a computer system and violations of that semantics, and we didn't want to confuse what we were doing with that. So many of our papers talk about cognitive hacking or cognitive attacks. But in a broader sense, you can look at this as really perception management. And so this has been around for a long time. I mean, thousands of years, not just since computers. And I'll go a little bit into some of the traditional definitions of computer security and how our definitions for semantic or cognitive hacking fit into those. So Dorothy Denning wrote a book a few years ago on information warfare, focused more on sort of economics rather than military kind of information warfare, just general everyday society. And she described perception management as information operations that aim to affect the perceptions of others in order to influence their emotions, reasonings, decisions, and ultimately actions. So we can think of this as being a continuum of things from propaganda to psychological operations and warfare to advertising or even education, at a more benevolent range of the continuum. And so these are just some related concepts of, from propaganda through advertising. You hear a lot about social engineering, and the first time we talked about this at a conference, people said, well, isn't this just social engineering that you're talking about? So we tried to come up with this example saying that, yes, there's some overlap, but really we're looking at something slightly different at least. So often in social engineering, somebody is trying to trick you into giving you a password or social security number, for identity theft or just logging on to computer system under your identity. And so that people have done studies where they offer a free ballpoint pen in exchange for the password or something like that, and the people often comply with that. But what we're more interested in is not just tricking somebody to get the password, but rather something where the computer system itself is used as an instrument of conveying that message to get the user to take some action. And I'll go into more detail about a typical example we looked at, which was a pump and dump scheme. And this is a scheme where someone's trying to manipulate the price of a company's stock, say by posting misleading postings in a discussion group on the web. And as a result of that, people buy or sell a stock, and the person perpetrating the fraud can make a profit on that. And so this is just sort of graphically representing Libicki's sort of taxonomy of physical attack, something just literally destroying the hardware, versus syntactic attacks, which you can think of as most of the sort of traditional areas of computer security, the things like viruses and worms and denial of service and so on. And semantic attacks, on the other hand, being things more like misinformation or maybe website defacement, spoofing, and so on. And another related area is information warfare or information operations in a military setting. So one very traditional definition in computer security that was stated in this 1981 paper by Carl Landwehr is information contained in an automated system must be protected from three kinds of threats: the unauthorized disclosure of information, the unauthorized modification of information, and the unauthorized withholding of information, also sometimes called confidentiality, integrity, and accessibility. And this definition originally came out in the context of sort of multiple classification level message handling systems. And in today's sort of web environment, e-commerce and so on, in a lot of ways, and many of the examples we'll talk about here, they don't really violate any of these, sort of three threats. So, things have changed in some ways in terms of what we would consider sort of semantic, kind of attacks. So the definition we ultimately came up with in this project for cognitive or semantic hacking was a networked information system attack that relies on changing human users' perceptions and corresponding behaviors in order to be successful. So unlike much of social engineering, it requires the use of the information system itself to convey the attack, not just something that you take advantage of once you've done the social engineering to access the system. And it also requires the user to change behavior, which isn't necessarily true for worms and viruses and so on. And all of this is exploiting our growing reliance on being increasingly networked with various information sources. So as a concrete example of this kind of pump and dump scheme I mentioned, in November '99, two UCLA graduate students and one other collaborator purchased nearly all of the shares of a bankrupt company, NEI Web World. And then they posted many messages in an internet message board to try to pump up the value of the stock. And they also pretended to be a company interested in acquiring this bankrupt company. And as a result of this, in one day, the value of the stock increased from 13 cents a share to $15 a share. And they quickly made $364,000. But they were caught, and in December '99, they were charged by the SEC and later sentenced to some time in jail, and they had to give up all their profits. Another very well-known case involved teenager, middle school, I believe, student in New Jersey, Jonathan Lebed, who did similar manipulations, but each time made large profits. But one of the interesting things about this case was, even though the SEC was very interested in prosecuting him, they eventually settled out of court, and he was allowed to keep about 500,000 of his earnings, because it was very gray area of the law. So in some way, he could say that what he was doing wasn't that different from some kind of stock professional that's just giving advice on the internet, despite the fact that he was 13 or 14 years old at the time he started doing it. But maybe this font's a little too small to read, but an example of the kind of thing he'd post is like the FTEC is starting to break out. Next week this thing will explode. Currently it's trading for just 2.5. I'm expecting to see 20 very soon. Let me explain why, and so on and so on. And so this is actually fairly mild writing style compared to some of these I've seen. But in any case, interestingly, the New York Times Magazine and various other, there's a book that was sort of half about this. There's been a lot written about this, and it turns out that not only were his classmates, but even some of the teachers at his school were all getting in on this when he was doing these kind of things. So it was sort of an interesting case. Another example was Emulex, where Mark Jacob had shorted these shares in Emulex, but the stock rose, and so he lost money. And so he, I guess, had formerly worked at this Internet Wire, and he still had an account there. He sent out a false press release claiming that this corporation was being investigated by the SEC, being forced to restate 1998-99 earnings, and as a result of this manipulation, made $236,000. So there is sort of economic perspective to these kind of manipulations, and you can tie this into work in software agents, or even economics work on theory of the firm. And so one of the things we were looking at was value of information. So in one of these, imagine you're a day trader and you see one of these news postings. And if this is valid, sort of true, reliable information, it's very important to act on it the second you see it and make a huge profit. But if somebody's manipulating your perception, you could lose everything by that quick action. So what we were trying to come up with were countermeasures that, someone in this situation might be able to, very quickly get some sense to whether this information was reliable or not, before acting. But on the other hand, the longer you delay, the longer it takes to, confirm that information, the more you potentially, the less your profit would be. So just as in the battle space that Libicki talked about, as systems are becoming more and more automated, and you're relying on information from various sensor networks and so on, just in the modern firm, there's more and more automation, and it's much easier to manipulate that information flow through misinformation. And one example of this was an exercise that Dartmouth and some other agencies were involved with, called Livewire, where there was a simulated attack by an adversary on the U.S. economy as a kind of cyber warfare, where you assume the adversary has several years and more or less unlimited resources to plan a 30-day attack against the U.S. economy by sort of lowering the confidence in our financial infrastructure. And so they simulated networks of various federal, state, and local organizations, some network companies and financial institutions, and sort of played out this scenario or exercise and saw how people reacted. So in sort of traditional economic theory, there's the assumption that that all the players have this perfect costless information. But in reality, it's not like that. Information isn't perfect. There's a cost associated with information flow. At the same, and so this is sort of this theory of the firm, which people were writing back in the 1920s. But as I was saying, as things are becoming more and more automated in firms, this overhead's being reduced, and the information can flow more readily. But at the same time, these systems are more vulnerable to these potentially to these semantic attacks. So one of the things we looked at was based on this horse race example from this information theory book. So you assume there are two horses in a race. It could be N horses, but here we're just talking about two. So you have a cognitive hacker, or who wants to lure an indecisive gambler or investor, say in one of these pump and dump schemes, to invest money on false prospects. So we were trying to show how, by manipulating the person's perception, what was sort of the most profitable way the semantic attacker could make this attack. So first, the attacker has to convince the investor that it's worth taking part in this game, and then manipulate the person to invest in a certain way. And so this is from Cover and Thomas's Elements of Information Theory. There are N horses in a race. Each horse I is assigned a probability pi of winning the race, and each horse I is assigned an odds, signifying the gambler would bet bi dollars on the horse I and win bi times oi dollars in case of victory, or suffer total loss in case of defeat. So W is defined as the doubling rate function, where after K plays, the expected value of the gambler's assets are 2 to the WK. And so we just did some sort of simulations showing, okay, for sort of 1 unit of effort of manipulation of perception, where do you get the biggest payoff in terms of manipulating the perception of the victim. So applying this to the Emulex example that we just talked about, sort of the two types of manipulations that Jacobs could have done were, on the one hand, to say something misleadingly positive about the company, like a successful new product release is imminent, or something misleadingly negative. In this case, the company is under investigation, and so on. And of course, it was the second that Jacobs took. So the next thing we did, after sort of coming up with a lot of examples like this and sort of classifying them as different types of semantic attacks or cognitive attacks, is we began to think of what possible countermeasures there could be to these attacks. And we divided these into two general categories of countermeasures. Those where there's just a single source of information. So you can't compare this misleading or possibly misreliable information to other sources of information. So there you have to worry about authenticating the source. We also talked about something called information trajectory modeling, or Ulam games. And I can come back to this if any of you are interested, but maybe in the interest of time I'll sort of skip over these for now. And then another type of situation is where there are multiple sources of information. So you could try to look at techniques such as the reliability of this source, or do collaborative filtering or recommender system type of technology to compare what other people say about this source, or what other sources are saying about this information. We didn't develop it. We were looking at Byzantine generals type models. We also considered things like collusion of information sources. So, in general, if you have multiple accounts of the same event happening, typically they're not all going to agree exactly with each other. But if you did see maybe almost identical agreement, on the one hand, maybe that's just because all these sources all got their information from the same original source, but it may be that they're conspiring with each other and collusion's going on. And the other sort of techniques we're looking at are linguistic analysis, which I'll say a little bit more about. So going back to some of the earlier measures, authentication of source would just involve due diligence in identifying the information source and ascertaining its reliability, looking at sort of traditional computer security kinds of things like certification, public key infrastructure sort of technology, and so on, or over time being able to build up rating and reputation systems such as, say, eBay uses to help establish trust in a particular source of information. The idea behind the information trajectory modeling was, maybe you could build a statistical model of how you expect the data to look. Like, and a good example, I think, of this is in weather forecasting, where on the one hand you have all this historical data, maybe going back 100 years, and more recent weather of just the last day or so, and they use supercomputers to build sort of elaborate models of this to try to predict the next day's weather. And similarly, financial analysts try to predict movement of stock prices. So especially in these pump and dump schemes, often they're manipulating very low cap stock price, and you could imagine it may be possible to build a model where if you see some real huge deviations from what's expected, at least it's indication that maybe something is amiss, some kind of manipulation is going on. And possibly something like this running in the background could alert people to something like these sort of pump and dump scheme manipulations. And this was just what I already talked about in terms of the collusion and so on. And similarly with collaborative filtering or reliability, you elicit feedback from users to try to get an idea of the reliability of an information source, like something like eBay. But some of these are fairly easy to overcome, though. So, and there have been examples of this, like on eBay, where people have built up a reputation as being a good, trustworthy trader by engaging in a fair number of relatively small transactions, and suddenly just pull off a big, major fraudulent transaction. And this model we didn't really develop, but I could say there's a message communication system with reliable and unreliable processes. These are the generals. Generals are plotting a coup. The reliable generals intend to complete the coup. The unreliable will betray the coup. So we thought we could apply this to some kind of, say, an e-commerce broker evaluating the reliability of sites before committing to a transaction. And this collusion of information sources I've already talked about. So because of some of my own background, as Christina mentioned, I've worked in information retrieval, but also in information extraction or natural language understanding. So I was sort of immediately gravitated to some of these more linguistic cases. So I mentioned the authorship attribution. And there was some interesting work a few years ago by researchers at IBM Watson Research where they tried to use some statistical analysis to do, looking at a situation where you have some anonymous postings in a web discussion group. And so you have a pool of candidate authors, and they were trying to look at how small an amount of text you would need to determine with a given threshold of certainty that a certain piece of text was written by a certain author. And they found it was required surprisingly little text to make a fairly accurate conclusion on that. And in part this is because on the web, text is much more idiosyncratic. With something like the Federalist Papers or other published work that's gone through an editorial process, some of that individual style of the individual author has been removed or smoothed over. And so it's much easier to pick this out and just sort of general web sort of text. And there's been some very recent research along these lines that may still be going on. There's a NSF-CIA Knowledge Discovery Dissemination Program where Madigan and others at Rutgers at DIMAX were looking at this authorship attribution problem. And there was a related project funded by the same program at USCISI, I believe. But another area that I've also considered, and I haven't done any work in this area yet, but automatic genre detection. Is there something about this misleading text, say of the Jonathan Levitt sort of text, that you could pick out and differentiate it from just the typical exaggerated day trader kinds of postings? And there was work 10 years or so ago by Schutz and Nunberg at Xerox PARC looking at automatic genre detection, for example. And I've talked with researchers at Park more recently that, they've told me that, things on the web have gotten, sort of much less, crisp, more of a mishmash, they said. And, so they're not really calling it genre detection anymore, but they're doing something like they call a sort of authority analysis or some such. But in any case, here you're not looking for the style of an individual author to identify the author, but rather just maybe there's something in this deliberately deceptive writing that you can pick up that would distinguish it from, just more general enthusiastic reporting about something, but it's not being deliberately deceptive. So towards the end of this project, we came up with a prototype, and we're interested in developing this countermeasure for misinforming news. So we assume that there's an end user who finds a possibly misinforming news item or discussion group posting. And again, this is sort of a pump and dump scheme kind of thing where if this is reliable information, the user could make a huge profit, but otherwise might lose everything. So we allow the user, in this case, to automatically generate a query from the text of the item, and we submit it to the Google News API, which then issues a query and comes back with maybe a few hundred or a few thousand textually similar news items. So we consider two different countermeasures, and one we call the news verifier. So the idea with this prototype was that stories would be optimally re-ranked and presented to the user. So Google comes back with some ranking of the news stories, but this is a ranking based on whatever algorithm that Google is using, but it's not a ranking designed for the purpose of detecting misinformation in the original story. So in any case, if you could come up with an optimal ranking of stories which would most likely assist the user in determining whether the original story was misinformation, then you could sort of leave it up to the user. So if you could, in your top, few, 2 or 3 ranks of the re-ranking, assist the user in that way, then this countermeasure could succeed. If, on the other hand, in your several hundred returned items, the ones which would really be most useful for the user were back there in ranks, 110 or something like that, user's never going to see them likely. So that was the first countermeasure. The second countermeasure, which we didn't get to implement because funding ran out at that point, was starts the same way. So you send off the query to the Google News API. It comes back with a collection of similar documents. But here the idea was to automatically analyze these rather than just showing a ranking to the user, and use something like the information trajectory model I described. And so in this approach, we would assume we have access to stock market price movements. We would be able to extract the ticker symbol from these news stories for the company and see if the movement of the stock price looks like it's out of line, implying that some manipulation was going on. So our experimental design was then to see whether the first countermeasure or the second measure would work better. And we got a set of data from University of Massachusetts Amherst, and there's a URL at the bottom if you're interested in this project. It was called eAnalyst, or an electronic analyst of financial markets. And then this originally started as a student project in a class at UMass, and they wanted to use it for stock market prediction. So they had a data set of news stories for about 9 months, around 2000, I think, and there were 121 publicly traded stocks that were mentioned in these news stories. There were ticker symbols in each story, and they had the stock market prices during the same time period for these 121 companies. And this was from the Center for Intelligent Information Retrieval, UMass Amherst. And so they used a data mining algorithm, something called activity monitoring, that was used for cell phone fraud detection, developed by Fossil and Provost, where they're monitoring the behavior of a large population of interesting events like cell phone fraud requiring some kind of action. And they were applying this to this sort of stock market prediction And so they were able to look at this as a time series because they had the timestamps on the news articles and, and the stock market price and so on. And I guess going back here to this project for a minute. So in my own earlier research, I developed an algorithm for probabilistic information retrieval that would be called like a meta search algorithm in today's sort of terminology. So we implemented the Lucene open source search engine and the Lemur probabilistic language modeling approach to information retrieval system of CMU and UMass Amherst, and combined those two. So we had this original set of documents returned by the Google News API, the Google ranking, the rankings of these other two search engines. We used my combination algorithm to get a combined ranking, and you could then, if the user was willing to take that long to do it, have the user provide relevance judgments for the first few documents looked at and use those to adjust the weights and do a re-ranking. You could also use this sort of machine learning algorithm to learn over time. And in this way, you could, determine, you could sort of, I guess your system could adapt to, produce rankings that were optimal for, doing this disambiguation rather than just the sort of relevance-based, for the purposes of document retrieval algorithms that presumably Google, Lucene, and Lemur use. Okay. So now broadening the scope of this work, another area besides these sort of pump and dump schemes where there's interest in this kind of deception is in the intelligence community. So there's this idea of denial and deception. So for example, there's the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which collects news from around the world to support open source intelligence analysis. And clearly misinformation could be planted in these stories intended to mislead analysts. And in more recent years, the FBIS is going beyond traditional sources of broadcast news and text and so on to collect more and more information from websites. And so again, there's more chance for this sort of denial and deception and an interest in being able to detect this deception. Then starting in 2003, the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Justice started a new annual conference called the Symposium on Intelligence and Security Informatics. And the rationale behind this was, just as we talk about things like bioinformatics or medical informatics, they claim we need a new scientific discipline of intelligence and security informatics. And I've been involved with this conference and only attended the first one, but at the first one, there were keynote speakers that were associated with the same program I mentioned earlier, the knowledge discovery and dissemination. And so with my background in document retrieval or information retrieval, it occurred to me that what would make this kind of informatics, one of the key factors that makes this difference from traditional, say, legal or medical or scientific informatics is, while you have occasional fraud in science and so on, for the most part, you take information at face value. But clearly in intelligence and security informatics, that wouldn't be the case. So you would be concerned with detecting deception and misinformation and so on. And it also occurred to me, some of my advisors in graduate school, besides working on probabilistic information retrieval, also developed models for utility theoretic retrieval. So instead of trying to predict the probability that a given document will be relevant for a particular user based on the features of the user, their information needed in the documents, instead you try to predict the utility this document would have for this user and rank according to utility. And I think that could also apply in these kind of situations. So it may not be, maybe it's less important that this document is on this topic as being able to know whether it's misinformation or reliable information. And even if it's misinformation, if you can detect that, it's still useful to know that. It might be have very high utility, in fact. And then getting back to Libicki's original concerns, clearly there's a large role for all of this in software agents and warfare, semantic attacks, information operations, and so on. So a little over a year ago, I was involved with a workshop at the Air Force Research Lab where they were planning a new program, which some of the BAs are just starting to come out for now, for the commander's predictive environment. And we were looking at detection, deception in that area. And more recently, I've started working on a project at Dartmouth called, well, our system's called adversarial intent inferencing. I guess the project's called adversarial reasoning. And one of the issues that we're looking at is not just deception at sort of the low level of an individual document or an individual face-to-face communication, whether in text, audio, or video, but how does this all play potentially into a larger, more strategic deception? So you think about things like in World War II when, the Allies are trying to conceal from the Germans that, D-Day invasion is going to take place at, Normandy. And so there were all kinds of elaborate things done to convince the Germans that it was going to take place somewhere else or a different time and so on. So we're interested in this idea of how can we achieve some kind of vertical integration between the low-level deception we may pick up and sort of map that into a more strategic deception that may be going on. And this is just still at sort of the speculative stage. We haven't actually begun doing this sort of work yet. So in one of these programs that I mentioned, there's been this novel intelligence and massive data program. All of the participants in this program were expected to read a book by Richard Hoyer on the psychology of intelligence analysis, where he develops a model called analysis of competing hypotheses, where if you're considering some hypothesis, and you could say maybe this is similar to the scientific method, so you consider all the possible hypotheses, you gather evidence on favor of the different hypotheses, weigh them, and come to your conclusion. Frank Steck at MITRE has developed a variant of this in a sort of prototype software system called analysis of competing hypotheses counter deception. And with Professor Santos at Dartmouth, we're also developing a system which we intend to apply to some of the same examples that Steck discussed, such as the Battle of Midway during World War II. So Steck, in turn, based his theoretical approach on a number of other earlier investigators. So I mentioned Hoyer, and so other work in deception detection has been done by Whaley and Busby, more in the business sort of literature and sort of financial fraud, accounting fraud areas. Johnson and others have developed models, and in more intelligence work, there's work by R.V. Jones. So they're basically taking some of the theoretical background from all these approaches and implementing them in a computer system for adversarial reasoning and deception detection. And they have a project where they apply this to detecting deception in within the say corporate financial filings. But there's a lot of controversy about some of this. So there was some fairly recent government study of polygraphs, for example, which called into question, just the validity of the whole technique. Or, people talk about detecting deception in video, but, it's unclear how accurate all of these really are. Well, I guess an issue in a lot of, sort of psychology sort of work is, okay, you can produce something in the laboratory with, freshman college students, but does this necessarily carry over into the real world, so to speak? And then again, even if you're able to achieve this deception detection at a lower level, then how do you integrate that with, looking for more strategic sort of deception? So one of the things we hope to do here was MITRE was developing a counterterrorism database, which was seeded with a deception scenario. And one of the things we hope to be able to do would be to apply various of these techniques we talked about to see if we could discover the documents in this database that were related to the scenario, and then determine where the deception was in the scenario and sort of unravel what was going on. So going back to this commander's predictive environment, we want to be able to, like say in a military setting, improve the understanding of the operational picture, be able to characterize and predict likely future events in the planning and execution process. So this is something to supporting the commander, and understanding the impact of decisions today. And in order to do all of this, you can't just assume you can take all of the information that's coming in through your sensor systems or intelligence reports at face value and just fuse the information and act accordingly. You have to actively consider there's going to be deception and trying to deal with that. So currently, I'm working on a project with Eugene Santos where we're trying to model an adversary using a Bayesian belief network representation where we have nodes representing the goals, axioms, beliefs, and actions, both of, well, basically we're modeling the adversary, so sort of the red group, and we're trying to infer the adversary's intent based on observations, and this intent can include deception. And we're trying to work up an example for this based on the Korean War and the Chinese intervention in the Korean War. And on the one hand, it doesn't seem like necessarily the best example because there was a lot of evidence that the Chinese were going to intervene. They weren't necessarily concealing that. And I think MacArthur just thought it wasn't worth considering, and everybody sort of deferred to his opinion, and the intervention happened. But as we're digging deeper into it, as in all sort of battlefield situations, there's always deception going on. And we think there are more strategic deception in this example that we can work with also. And of course, one reason for looking at the Korean War is it's long enough ago that this is information is more readily available than, say, something more recent. So let's see. I think we're sort of drawing close to the closing time. Maybe I should pause and ask if there are any questions at this point. Yes?
So I think a very good source of information would be looking at poker games.
Yes.
It is
Right.
a deception game.
Right. Well, in fact, Whaley, in one of his books he wrote on deception, he does talk a lot about games and magic tricks and things like that as well, as sort of prototypical examples of what he's looking at. Good point.
You have to ask them not to, wear the sunglasses. If you look at some of the things that you can see on TV, like you see that they're always wearing glasses. They have like big hoods, so you cannot read much from their expressions, for example.
Right. Right. So there's not many observations you can see to try to determine intent. Yes, Victor?
Two brief comments. One, it's interesting that you, unless I missed it, you never mentioned the name of Paul Ekman, and I'm happy that you didn't.
Right.
This is a psychologist who claims that he can detect deception just on the basis of facial expressions.
Right. I think I had facial expressions on one of the slides, but I didn't say it further.
And
Right.
That was, of course, a very overextended claim. Basically, he says that when we lie, we roll our eyes and sweat profusely. He hasn't met me personally. His database was not complete. I come from the Soviet Union, so I lie professionally. Christina understands it also. Eastern Europe. The other thing that I wanted to mention is not an omission. I know that Paul is very familiar with CERIAS work in semantic forensics, and semantic forensics was mentioned on one of the slides, but I look around the room, I'm not sure that this group is aware that we have led the meaning-based strength in this kind of research. Most of the work that Paul is talking about is based on formal criteria, keywords, Boolean algebra, Bayesian frequencies and stuff, and marvelous work has been done. And all of that hits the semantic barrier. That is, humans detect deception on the basis of understanding things. And we have that capability here with the resources developed at CERIAS, thanks to excellent people like Reasonable.
Right.
We reported that at our annual research symposium. Anybody who's interested, talk to us.
So maybe they should all try to come to the next symposium, which should be, I think, pretty soon, like March or April.
Well, we talked about semantic forensics. Did we talk about forensics? Yeah, I think we did. But also in this connection, I don't know whether I mentioned it to you. I will talk about it over dinner. I'm consulting for a new search engine development called Hakia.com, which is meaning-based and credibility ranking, independent of Google, God forbid, or whatever, but based on pretty much semantic forensics, is built into it. So there is a silent beta release right now, which already outperforms Google 10 to 15% in terms of performance, but ontological semantics is not hooked up fully there. In later versions, every single